Imagine being trapped in a nightmare you can't wake up from. Your body smeared with honey, left to the blazing sun, tied between two boats while insects slowly eat you alive. Not for minutes, not for hours, but for days, maybe weeks. That's the terror of Scaphism, an execution so grotesque, so cruel, that historians have argued for centuries whether it was even real. But if it was, then it may be the single worst punishment humans ever devised. We've heard of crucifixions, of burning at the stake, of beheadings and hangings. But Scaphism belongs to another level, an endurance test of pain and humiliation designed not just to kill, but to erase a person's dignity piece by piece. The Persians, who perfected it, didn't just want death. They wanted suffering that lingered like a legend. And in this story, you'll discover why the victim's torment lived on far longer than his body ever could. To begin, let's go back to the Persian Empire, centuries before Rome reached its peak. The Achaemenid Persians were masters of power, builders of roads, rulers of nations, creators of one of the most advanced civilizations of their time. Yet beneath the glory of kings like Darius and Xerxes, there existed an obsession with punishment, especially for those who betrayed the empire. One man's betrayal, according to ancient sources, was punished with Scaphism. His name was Mithridates, a Persian soldier who dared to betray King Artaxerxes II. The story is told by the Greek historian Plutarch. Now, Plutarch wasn't shy about recording the extremes of human cruelty. And when he describes Scaphism, he does so with a kind of horrified fascination, as if even writing the words made his skin crawl. According to his account, Mithridates had boasted that he killed the Persian king's brother in battle. For this arrogance, the king ordered him condemned, not to a quick death, but to the slowest one imaginable. The punishment began with two boats. The victim was stripped naked and laid inside one boat. Another boat was placed on top, sandwiching his body so only his head, arms and legs stuck out. Then came the honey and milk, gallons of it. His face was smeared, his mouth forced open to drink, and his exposed skin was drenched in the sweet mixture. At first, this may have seemed merciful, almost pleasant compared to whips and chains, but the trap was only beginning. The sun baked down, the honey turning sticky and sour. Flies, mosquitoes, and beetles swarmed to the scent, crawling into his nose, his ears, his mouth. They laid eggs in his flesh, gnawed at his skin, and multiplied in the Guards continued to force-feed him milk and honey, ensuring his stomach revolted, so diarrhea poured into the bottom of the boat, a stinking cesspool that attracted yet more swarms of vermin. He wasn't just tied down, he was turned into a living hive. His body, once a soldier's weapon, was now food for thousands of crawling things. Plutarch writes that Mithridates endured this for 17 days before death finally came. 17 days of blistering sun, searing thirst, insects burrowing into wounds, and the humiliation of rotting alive. It wasn't just an execution. It was a spectacle, a lesson to any who thought to defy Persian kings, and in the ancient world where stories spread faster than armies, this tale carried weight. Betrayal after Scaphism was not just treason, it was an invitation to hell on earth. But here's the twist. Did this really happen? Some modern historians argue that Plutarch, writing centuries later, exaggerated or even invented the account to demonize the Persians. After all, the Greeks and Persians were bitter rivals, their wars legendary. Could Scaphism have been propaganda, a way to paint Persia as a land of monsters? Or did humans really devise such a punishment? Skeptics point out that no Persian records mention it. Only Greek sources do. And yet the detail is so vivid, so grotesquely specific, that many wonder, could anyone have imagined it unless it happened? Perhaps there was one case, one terrible execution so extreme that even enemies whispered about it for centuries. Or maybe, just maybe, Scaphism was not myth but method, repeated in dark corners of history where no record survived. As we move forward, the question deepens, because while Scaphism may sound like ancient horror, it's not as far removed from modern times as we'd like to believe. Mankind has always found ways to stretch pain, to make death slow, to break not just bodies but souls. And in Scaphism we glimpse something timeless, the need of rulers to terrify their people, to show that betrayal has a price worse than imagination. But before we dive deeper into the debates, the skeptical voices and the chilling modern parallels, we must sit with Mithridates a little longer. Imagine his screams echoing across the Persian rivers, the guards watching coldly, the crowd whispering in disbelief. Imagine the insects crawling, the honey thickening, the days blurring together until even time itself became torture. That image, once seen, is not forgotten. And that is exactly what the Persians, or at least their enemies, wanted the world to remember. Yet the most haunting part isn't just the story itself. It's the possibility that this was only one man. How many others may have suffered the same fate, their names lost to time, their agony erased except for the rumor of Scaphism? And if this was real, what does it say about us as humans? That somewhere in our past, someone thought this was justice, and that perhaps is why this story refuses to die. Because whether true or exaggerated, Scaphism forces us to face a question: how far will power go to protect itself, and how far will cruelty go when given permission? Stay with me, because in the next part we'll unravel how this execution entered history, how it was retold across cultures, and how modern scholars wrestle with its truth. And the answer may disturb you even more than the story itself. The story of Mithridates and Scaphism lingers like a nightmare, but nightmares often leave us asking, did it really happen, or was it just a trick of the mind? Historians, philosophers, and modern readers have wrestled with this very question for centuries. Because if we're honest, Scaphism sounds almost too cruel, too perfectly horrifying to be real. Could the human imagination have invented it to slander an enemy? Or was it precisely that cruelty which ensured the story's survival? Our main source is the Greek historian Plutarch, writing nearly 400 years after the supposed event. His work Lives of Artaxerxes is where Scaphism appears in shocking detail. But here's the catch: Plutarch wasn't Persian. He wasn't even alive during the time of Artaxerxes. He was writing from afar, relying on second-hand accounts, legends, and perhaps political bias. The Greeks had fought brutal wars with Persia. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and the memory of those conflicts colored everything they wrote. To the Greeks, Persia wasn't just an empire. It was the other, a symbol of excess and tyranny. And what better way to paint tyrants than to describe punishments beyond the imagination of civilized men? Skeptical historians point out that no Persian records confirm Scaphism. The Persians, in fact, left behind remarkable inscriptions, laws, and royal decrees. They were builders of roads, engineers of irrigation systems, administrators of vast territories. Their empire thrived on bureaucracy and order. Would such a civilization really create a punishment as bizarre and impractical as Scaphism? After all, why go to the trouble of constructing boats, force-feeding milk and honey, and waiting weeks for insects to do their work when simpler executions, beheading, crucifixion, impalement, were already terrifying and effective? And yet, there is a detail that gnaws at us. Plutarch's description is so elaborate, so specific, that it feels rooted in something more than invention. He doesn't just say Mithridates was tortured. He describes the honey, the excrement, the insects, the 17-day ordeal. Too much detail, some argue, to be pure fantasy. Perhaps there was one case, one grotesque execution carried out in the chaos of war or political revenge, which horrified witnesses so deeply that it became legend. Like a scar, passed down through whispered stories until Plutarch finally carved it into history. Other ancient authors offer echoes, though less vivid. Some mention punishments involving insects or prolonged exposure to the elements. In India, for example, there are tales of criminals smeared in honey and tied to trees as food for ants. In Babylon, criminals were sometimes left to the scorching sun until madness overtook them. Could Plutarch have woven these regional practices into one monstrous tale, branding it with the name of Scaphism? Modern scholars split sharply. Some dismiss it outright as propaganda, a piece of Greek theater masquerading as history. Others argue that human cruelty has never needed much imagination. It only needed opportunity. Consider medieval Europe, the rack, the Iron Maiden, being drawn and quartered. Consider ancient Rome, prisoners sewn into sacks with snakes or condemned to face wild beasts in the arena. Against such a backdrop, is Scaphism truly so unbelievable? And then there's the psychological angle. Perhaps Scaphism's horror lies not in whether it was real, but in what it represents. Think of it. The fear of insects crawling beneath your skin, the humiliation of your body becoming filth, the helplessness of being trapped for days with no escape. These are primal terrors, Whether or not Scaphism was real, the story works because it strikes at the deepest layers of human dread. It's less about Persia and more about us, our instinctive recoil from decay, infestation, and the slow erosion of dignity. But let's not stop at ancient sources. In the modern world, anthropologists and forensic experts have tried to analyze whether Scaphism could even work biologically. Could a man survive 17 days in such conditions? The answer, disturbingly, is yes. With force-feeding of milk and honey, his body would not shut down immediately. Diarrhea, dehydration, and infection would weaken him, but insects are patient executioners. They thrive in filth. Medical journals describe cases of emeosis, the infestation of living tissue by fly larvae, lasting days or even weeks in untreated patients. Now imagine the deliberately engineered. The skin blistering under sun, the wounds kept moist by sweat and excrement, the flies laying eggs in every crevice. Death would not come quickly. It would creep exactly as Plutarch described. There are modern parallels too, grim reminders that cruelty doesn't vanish with time. During the 20th century, prisoners of war and political captives in several regimes endured prolonged tortures designed not just to kill, but to dehumanize. Accounts of men locked in tiny cages in the blazing sun, of prisoners covered in sugar water to attract insects, of victims left in swamps to be consumed by mosquitoes, all echo the principles of Scaphism. Different names. Same philosophy make the body itself the battlefield of torment. And here lies the uncomfortable truth. Even if Scaphism as described never occurred, the idea of it has echoed through time because it captures a universal theme of power and cruelty. Kings, tyrants, and regimes have always sought not just to punish, but to terrify. A quick death silences a man. A slow death retold in whispers silences nations. Whether myth or memory, Scaphism accomplished its goal. Thousands of years later, we are still shuddering at the thought. So where does that leave us? Was Mithridates truly eaten alive by insects, or was his fate exaggerated by enemies of Persia? Was Scaphism a real practice or a cautionary tale? Perhaps the answer is less important than the impact. The power of the story is its endurance. Like the man trapped in honey between the boats, we too are caught between two possibilities, truth and fiction, and neither offers comfort. But before you decide, consider this. History is filled with punishments once dismissed as myths only to be confirmed later. The Viking blood eagle was long doubted until closer readings of sagas suggested it may have occurred. Accounts of medieval torture, once thought impossible, have been corroborated by archaeological evidence. Could Scaphism, too, wait in the shadows of history for proof? Or is its greatest power precisely that it cannot be proven, leaving us haunted by the possibility? In the next part, we'll look beyond Persia, into the echoes of Scaphism across cultures, the executions that mirror its horror, and real cases where insects, confinement, and slow death became weapons of terror. And there you may find that even if Scaphism was legend, its spirit has never truly left us. Scaphism may sound like the darkest invention of the Persian Empire, but if we step back, we discover that history is littered with punishments just as cruel, each designed not only to kill but to terrify. It is here that the debate becomes even more haunting. Even if Scaphism was exaggerated, the world has seen enough real horrors to make it believable. And that's perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Take the Roman Empire. Rome gave the world laws, aqueducts, and engineering marvels, but it also gave us the arena where death became entertainment. Imagine a criminal or slave thrown unarmed into the Colosseum, facing a lion, starved for days. The roar of the beast, the scream of the victim, the cheers of 50,000 spectators. The Romans even had punishments called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Not just executions, but spectacles designed to send a message. Rome's power is absolute. Compared to this, is Scaphism really so impossible? And then there's the Mongols, feared across Eurasia for their ruthlessness. Chroniclers record that captives were sometimes sealed into boxes with only tiny breathing holes, left to starve as their bodies rotted in place. In one case, a Mongol Khan is said to have poured molten silver into the eyes and mouth of an enemy general, a fate just as grotesque as being lowered into boiling oil. These were not myths. Archaeological evidence and consistent accounts confirm them. Cruelty, it seems, was a universal language. Even closer to Scaphism is the Viking blood eagle. For centuries, historians dismissed it as myth, too brutal to be true. The sagas describe a victim's ribs being cut from the spine, lungs pulled outward like wings. It sounded like the invention of poets, but modern scholars have re-examined the texts and found surgical plausibility. It may well have happened, perhaps not often, but enough to scar memory. Like Scaphism, it walked the line between the unbelievable and the unforgettable. What these examples show is chilling. Every civilization, from the most refined to the most warlike, has experimented with slow, symbolic deaths. Punishments weren't always about justice. They were theater messages carved into flesh for the audience to absorb. If Rome used beasts, if Mongols used boxes and silver, if Vikings carved wings from human backs, why should Persia be exempt from inventing boats filled with honey and insects? But let's move beyond legends. Consider real cases documented with certainty. In 15th century France, a man named François Ravaillac, assassin of King Henry IV, was executed by being drawn and quartered. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers before his body was literally ripped apart by horses pulling in 4 directions. Thousands watched. In England, traitors were hanged until half dead, then disemboweled while still conscious, their entrails burned before their eyes. These were not exaggerations. Court records detail them. Witnesses describe the screams. If Europe in the Renaissance could stomach such horrors, why not Persia centuries earlier? And it doesn't stop in the distant past. In the 20th century, during the brutal reign of Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, prisoners at Chuol Sleng were subjected to slow, deliberate tortures before execution. Insects, starvation, confinement, methods not unlike Scaphism, were used to break both body and spirit. In Sudan, there are documented cases of prisoners being tied to ant hills as punishment. Even in prisons of modern dictatorships, inmates have been smeared with sugar water or honey to attract insects as a form of humiliation and torment. Scaphism may have been rare, but its spirit has lived on in many names and forms. Think of the psychology behind it. Quick executions serve justice. Food justice. Slow executions serve fear. They don't just kill the victim, they transform him into a warning. Plutarch may have exaggerated, yes, but what he described matches a universal pattern: rulers who believe that power must be demonstrated not only in victory, but in how their enemies die. And yet here's the twist. For all its cruelty, Scaphism holds a strange allure in the modern imagination. Why? Because it taps into primal fears that are timeless. Insects invading the body, the loss of control, the slow awareness of your own decay. Modern horror films rely on similar themes. Think of the fascination with zombies, with parasites, with the idea of being consumed from within. Scaphism is not just ancient history. It is a story that echoes in our darkest fantasies, in every nightmare of infestation and rot. At this point, you might wonder, if so many cultures had their own Scaphism, why does this one stand out? Perhaps because it is so visual, so symbolic. The boats enclosing the body like a coffin, the honey coating the skin, turning nourishment into poison. The insects, creatures we normally swat away without thought, elevated to the role of executioners. It's almost poetic in its cruelty, a punishment designed not only to kill, but to tell a story. And that is why we still tell it 2,000 years later. In the end, whether Scaphism was fact or fiction may not even matter. Its power lies in the way it mirrors what we already know, that humans, across time and space, have always been capable of crafting deaths that reflect their deepest fears. The Romans feared wild beasts, so they fed men to lions. The Vikings feared dishonor, so they carved lungs into wings. The Persians feared betrayal, so perhaps they built boats of death and let insects do the rest. Different methods, same lesson. Power must be seen, fear must be felt, and death must be remembered. But the story is not over. In the next chapter, we'll step into the modern era of science and skepticism, where researchers dissect whether Scaphism could physically happen, and will confront one last disturbing question. Do legends like these survive because they warn us, or because part of us is fascinated by cruelty? Imagine a body trapped between 2 wooden shells, smeared with milk and honey, left to the mercy of the summer sun. Insects gather, wings buzzing, legs crawling, mandibles biting. But pause for a moment. Could this really work the way Plutarch described? Could a person survive long enough, days or even weeks, for insects to literally eat them alive? Here is where history meets biology, and the results are as fascinating as they are chilling. First, let's talk about the biology of decay. When a body dies, insects arrive astonishingly fast. Forensic entomologists, scientists who study how insects interact with corpses, have proven that within hours, flies can detect death from kilometers away. They lay eggs, and within a day, maggots hatch, wriggling into soft tissue. If this was a living body, restrained and kept alive with water and food, the process would not stop. It would only stretch out, turning days into weeks of torment. The conclusion was grim. Biologically, Scaphism could happen. Historically, it only needed to happen once to become legend. But here's the darkest twist. Even if Scaphism never occurred exactly as Plutarch wrote, it has happened in spirit. In the 17th century, travelers in India reported rebels punished by being smeared with syrup and left tied to trees, consumed by insects. In parts of Africa, explorers witnessed criminals bound near termite mounds, their skin eaten away. In modern prisons, there are whispered accounts of men left in solitary confinement with infestations, their wounds crawling with maggots. Each echoes the same ancient nightmare, death by insects, slow and merciless. So is Scaphism real? Perhaps it doesn't matter. The horror lies not in whether one Persian tyrant invented it, but in the fact that humanity could. The image alone is enough. A man trapped in boats, his body both preserved and consumed, a living banquet for the smallest creatures of the earth. Whether fact, exaggeration, or allegory, it tells us something about ourselves, that we are drawn to extremes, to stories that test the limits of body and soul. And yet, as haunting as this is, there is one final chapter we must confront, because beyond the biology, beyond the skepticism, beyond the cruelty of the ancients, there is a question that belongs to us today. Why do we keep telling this story? Why, in a world filled with new horrors, does Scaphism remain so powerful? In the next chapter, we'll step into the modern mind to explore what our fascination with torture says about us and whether remembering these stories is a warning or a temptation. Picture this. Centuries have passed since the last Persian king, since the last chronicler wrote down the story of Scaphism. The empires that once struck terror into their neighbors have fallen into dust. And yet somehow this single execution method, a man trapped in boats, fed milk and honey, left to rot under the sun, still lives in our imagination. Why? Why does a story so grotesque, perhaps even exaggerated, refuse to die? The answer lies not in Persia, but in us. Human beings are drawn to stories of extremes. From the gladiator arenas of Rome to today's Hollywood horror films, we lean forward when cruelty is described. Our hands cover our mouths, but our eyes refuse to look away. Scaphism is not just an ancient punishment, it's a mirror of our own obsession with the darkest corners of human possibility. Psychologists have long studied this paradox. Why do people watch horror movies? Why do true crime podcasts rank among the most listened to worldwide? The reason is the same: controlled exposure to fear. Our brains are wired to rehearse danger. By hearing about the worst thing that can happen, we feel prepared even if we never face it ourselves. Scaphism, in this sense, is a story of ultimate loss of control, the nightmare of being consumed alive by forces too small to fight. To hear it is to confront the deepest helplessness imaginable. But there's another reason these tales endure: moral theater. Ancient writers didn't tell stories of torture merely to disgust. They told them to teach. The story of Mithridates, the man supposedly condemned to Scaphism for betraying the Persians, wasn't just a horror tale, it was a cautionary one. Betray your king, betray your people, and you could face a death worse than death itself. Centuries later, Roman and Greek writers retold it not only to highlight Persian cruelty, but to hold up Rome as more civilized. Every retelling added new moral lessons about loyalty, about hubris, about the thin line between justice and vengeance. And yet, as history rolled on, Scaphism transformed. By the time it reached the Victorians, it was stripped of its moral weight and turned into spectacle. Newspapers printed grisly details, knowing readers would buy more issues. Today, YouTube thumbnails and TikTok reels echo the same impulse. Bold text, dark imagery, promises of the worst punishment in history. It's the same story, recycled for a new age. What was once whispered in fear is now packaged as entertainment. But perhaps most chilling of all is how often Scaphism has been echoed in real life. We'd like to think we've moved past ancient cruelty, that modernity has civilized us, and yet history tells a different story. In the 20th century, reports surfaced of prisoners of war in Southeast Asia being tied near swarms of insects. their wounds left untreated, their screams filling the jungle night. In Nazi camps, inmates were sometimes deliberately left in filthy conditions where maggots would infest untreated wounds, an echo of the same living decay. Even as late as the 1970s, in certain conflicts, rebels were said to smear captured enemies with syrup and leave them staked out under the sun. Humanity never truly abandoned the imagination of Scaphism. We only changed the setting. And this brings us to the uncomfortable truth. We keep this story alive because it belongs to us. It represents the darkest capacities of human imagination. To invent such a punishment required not only cruelty but creativity. The mind that thought of it wasn't content with a sword or a noose. It wanted a death that was slow, humiliating, and unforgettable. And in remembering it, in retelling it, we prove that part of us still seeks the limits of endurance. But what does that say about us today? Consider how we consume media. Entire TV series are built on torture as spectacle, Game of Thrones, Vikings, countless crime dramas. Documentaries about serial killers top streaming charts. Even our most popular video games often revolve around creative ways of inflicting pain. Are we really so different from the crowds of Carthage who watched Marcus Atilius Regulus lowered into boiling oil, or the Persian courtiers who might have whispered about Mithridates' torment? Some cultural critics argue that stories like Scaphism desensitize us, that by replaying cruelty we normalize it. Others insist the opposite, that these stories act as a pressure valve, allowing us to confront darkness in safe ways so we don't enact it in reality. The truth may lie somewhere between. Scaphism endures because it horrifies and fascinates, because it invites us to stare at the abyss and then step back, grateful it is not us inside those boats. And perhaps that is why, in the end, Scaphism's real legacy is not about Persia at all. It's about memory. When you heard this story, you probably felt revulsion, maybe disbelief, maybe even a grim curiosity. That reaction is the same one people felt 2,000 years ago. Fear, fascination, disgust, relief. These emotions bind us across centuries, making Scaphism not just an ancient tale but a living one. So as the credits roll on this story, ask yourself, why did you listen? Was it morbid curiosity, a desire to know the worst humanity could invent? Or was it something deeper, the need to test your own courage against the unimaginable? Perhaps that is the final irony of Scaphism. The man in the boats was trapped, powerless, reduced to food for insects. But you, safe in your chair, are free to walk away, free to close your eyes, free to forget. Yet you won't, because once heard, Scaphism never leaves you. It lingers, buzzing in the back of the mind like the wings of a fly, a reminder of what cruelty can create and of the dark stories we cannot stop telling.